I was staying at a campground in the Serengeti when I started talking with another tourist from our safari group, an Austrian guy named Michael. We joked about how terrifying it would be if hyenas wandered into camp at night. There were no fences and no guards, so we were basically sleeping in the middle of the park. I had already told Michael that hyenas were common after dark and could be dangerous, which made the joke less funny. Later that night, after Michael made one last trip to the primitive bathroom, he noticed something moving in the darkness behind the building. He decided to mess with me and came back grinning. "There's a white hyena behind the toilet," he said. I didn't believe him, but after a few beers I was willing to play along. We walked around behind the bathroom and pointed our flashlights toward the bushes, expecting to see some strange-looking hyena. What we saw instead immediately sobered us up. It wasn't a pale hyena at all. There was a lion standing roughly 25 feet away from us. We didn't stick around. We backed away and got out of there as quickly as we could without attracting its attention. Looking back, the sighting actually made sense. Earlier that evening, just before it became dark, we'd seen our first lion of the day. From there, our group had driven directly back to camp, which was less than a kilometer away. We had unknowingly driven almost straight toward it. I told my wife what happened, and I also mentioned it to one of the camp employees. The employee laughed it off and said hyenas were the bigger problem. That didn't make me feel better. My wife and I eventually went to sleep inside our tiny two-person tent, which was only around 200 or 300 feet from the place where we'd seen the lion. The beer helped me fall asleep almost immediately, but a couple of hours later I woke up to the unsettling laughter of several hyenas moving around the campsite. They had started tearing at some garbage bins about 50 feet from our tent. For hours they growled, fought, and made those eerie sounds over the food and trash. I stayed awake for roughly 4 hours, listening to them move around outside. I could hear their footsteps between the tents, and several times they brushed against ours. In the dark, I kept thinking about what I'd do if one got inside. I had no weapon or real plan. Eventually, I decided I'd probably go for the eyes if I had to defend myself. Thankfully, I never had to use it. The next morning, our guide seemed unconcerned about the hyenas. What had really bothered him was the lion. After hearing our description, he believed it was probably a young male that had been following or approaching the camp. According to him, female lions generally avoid getting close to humans, while males can present more of a threat. He also thought the lion might have been pushed out of its pride, meaning it could have been hungry and looking for an opportunity. Hearing that in daylight was somehow worse than seeing the lion at night. And the wildlife encounters didn't stop there. The following night, while camping along the Ngorongoro crater, about a dozen of us sat around a campfire when 2 enormous elephants appeared silently from the darkness of the forest. They were only a few feet from us before we even realized they were there. The male drank from a basin beside the shower building, then both elephants disappeared into the trees. About half an hour later, another group of animals wandered into camp. Around 20 zebras came through and began grazing between the tents. They stayed until morning. By then, I wasn't sure whether to be impressed or nervous. The animals clearly didn't care that we considered our tents a safe place. Last summer, my brother and I went camping in a well-known woodland area in the Peak District in the UK. The place had some old stone circles that I believe had some pagan significance, although I didn't know much about them. We arrived one summer day, set up our campsite, and ate some mushrooms while we were getting settled. After that, we spent a few hours sitting around watching the trees move and enjoying the effects. At some point, a man with a dog appeared a little way from us. There were usually several groups camping in the forest, so seeing another person wasn't unusual. What was strange was where he was. We were camped away from the main paths, yet this guy kept circling around the same area instead of simply passing through. I was still tripping at the time, so I wasn't sure whether I could trust my own judgment, but something about him felt wrong. At first, I kept telling myself that the mushrooms were probably making everything seem more threatening than it really was. That was why I tried to explain away his behavior instead of reacting to it immediately. But as the effects wore off, I noticed that the uneasy feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, being more clear-headed made his behavior harder to dismiss. I still couldn't explain why then. He kept shouting to himself, throwing water around, and even lying flat on the ground with his arms and legs spread out. He would stay there for several minutes, get back up, and then do something else equally strange. I figured he might have been under the influence of something too, and was simply having his own bizarre adventure. A couple more hours passed, and we were beginning to come down from our trip. We built a fire, and that was when the man finally came over. Up close, he was a big, strongly built guy, wearing military-style clothing and carrying a military-looking backpack. He asked if we had any firewood because there wasn't much around. We gave him some, and then he asked whether he could sit with us and have a beer and a spliff. We weren't especially comfortable with the idea, but we agreed. He sat down beside the fire, and for a little while everything seemed manageable. Then the conversation became increasingly strange. For roughly half an hour, he talked as though he were living inside a completely different version of reality. He told us that people were always approaching him and telling him he was the one. Then asked whether that was the reason we had come to the forest. He said the government was tracking him through Facebook, although when we questioned him about it, he admitted he didn't even have a Facebook account. He also claimed he had discovered microchips hidden in the legs of his trousers. Then he suddenly said they were even inside his toothpaste. It was hard to follow because he seemed to be carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there. Every so often he would suddenly shout, "It's just so embarrassing," without any obvious connection to what we'd been discussing. When my brother asked what he meant, the man just mumbled that it was nothing. I tried asking him how he had managed to get into such a remote part of the forest, since he hadn't arrived in a car. He immediately turned toward me and reacted aggressively, asking whether I was joking. What made the whole thing more uncomfortable was how quickly he switched back to acting normal afterward, as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, our dog was growling at him. His dog was also making things awkward by repeatedly jumping on me, and I kept trying to push it away. The man made no real effort to control it. I was already uncomfortable with the conversation, and now I had a strange dog climbing all over me while his owner continued talking, as though everything was perfectly ordinary. Eventually, the conversation took another turn. He casually asked whether we minded if he smoked some crack. Before either of us could really respond, he had already produced a pipe and started smoking. At that point, I was pretty certain this was not a person I wanted to spend much more time around. Strangely enough, he seemed calmer afterward. He stayed with us for perhaps another 10 minutes, then stood up and said that he'd said what he needed to say and would get out of our way. He walked roughly 50 meters away and started building a huge fire of his own. It was so large that the flames were practically reaching the branches above him. The second he moved away, my brother went into the tent and started packing our things. Neither of us needed to say much. We both understood staying there was a bad idea, so we packed as quickly and quietly as we could and prepared to leave. I think it was also the night of a blood moon. The moon looked enormous, and there were quite a few other people moving around the forest at that hour, maybe around 9 or 10 at night. Among them was a group dressed in white clothing that looked like druid outfits. There were also people carrying equipment that looked like something out of a ghost hunting setup, apparently scanning the stone circles. Normally, that might have been an interesting sight. After what had just happened, it only made the whole place feel stranger. We walked directly out of the forest, both of us half expecting the man to come after us. Once we reached the car, I suggested finding another camping spot somewhere else. My brother immediately rejected the idea. He said he was going home, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. We drove back instead. It ended up being one of the strangest nights either of us had ever experienced, and the unsettling part wasn't any single thing the man did. It was how quickly a normal camping trip turned into a situation where leaving felt like the only sensible option. We were on a scout trip in northern Utah, doing some hiking, fishing, and merit badge work. Our scout leader said the place was called Mirror Lake and that an old friend had camped there about 25 years earlier. The friend and two others had experienced something strange there. They had an ordinary fishing trip with no alcohol or anything else that could have distorted what they experienced. On their final night, they settled into their tent and went to sleep. Steve fell asleep first. Not long afterward, he and Mike woke up after hearing a distant noise that sounded like an animal calling from across the lake. As they became alert, they realized Jacob was gone. They assumed he'd gone to the bathroom. But after several minutes, they became uneasy and went looking for him. Just as they began searching, they heard an ear-piercing screech in the darkness, followed by Jacob's terrified scream. They ran back to the tent and focused on surviving until morning. They hoped whatever had found Jacob hadn't noticed their tent. They decided to sleep in shifts, leave at first light, and contact the authorities. Several shifts passed quietly. When Steve slept again, exhaustion took over, but he soon woke to Mike moving around inside the tent. Mike was putting on his shoes. Steve asked where he was going, but Mike didn't answer. Steve grabbed his shoulder and turned him around. Mike's face was blank, his eyes wide and glazed, reflecting the light like the lake. He muttered that he needed to go. Steve tried convincing him to wait until morning. Mike ignored him. Then they heard another sound like the one from earlier, only this time it was much closer. Mike immediately went rigid and tried harder to leave the tent. Steve panicked. He didn't know what was happening, but refused to let Mike walk into the darkness after Jacob. Mike managed to break free and started unzipping the entrance. Steve tackled him, pinned him down, and covered his mouth in case he called out to whatever was outside. For what felt like a long time, Steve held him there. Eventually, daylight filtered through the trees. Mike stopped fighting, and the strange look disappeared from his eyes. When Steve asked why he'd been trying to leave, Mike had no memory of it. They packed up, hurried to the car, and drove until they had service to call police. Later that night, we decided to play a cruel joke on another boy who had fallen asleep in his tent. We all quietly left and let him believe we'd been taken by the trance. He was terrified for about 2 minutes before someone admitted the truth. The story still bothered me. One year, a group of us went camping in Kearney, Ontario, a place we visited regularly. Whenever we camped there, we arranged our tents in a large circle with a fire pit in the center. That night, we'd been drinking, smoking, and some people were also taking mushrooms. On the first night, a man we'd never seen before walked into our circle and introduced himself. I can't remember his name. He said he was in the military and had decided to use some vacation time to go camping. He hadn't bought any firewood, so he asked to join our fire. We let him join us, and he contributed money for the firewood. Everything seemed normal as we talked, drank, and eventually went to bed. I was one of the first to go to bed. Around 4 in the morning, I woke to someone talking and saw the fire had been started again. I looked out from my tent and saw the stranger sitting alone on a log beside the fire, talking to himself. I was still affected by the mushrooms, so I figured I might be imagining it and went back to sleep. By morning, everyone was safe and the fire was smoldering. We looked toward the stranger's campsite. It was spotless, with no garbage, signs of sleep or disturbed trail. We started talking about him to make sure we'd all seen the same person. Comparing what everyone remembered, we realized something else. The last two people from our group had gone to sleep shortly after 3:30 in the morning, while the first person to wake up did so just after 6. Apparently, the stranger hadn't slept at all. The rest of the trip was uneventful, and we went home. About 4 or 5 years later, I was watching the news when a picture appeared on the screen. I recognized the man's face immediately. The man had been arrested for several serious crimes, including rape and murder. I couldn't prove it was the same man, but I immediately remembered the stranger from our fire. I don't even know why I remembered him so clearly. Maybe my brain simply saved his face because something felt unusual. He may have no picture of him, so I couldn't compare them. He may have only looked similar, but seeing that photograph brought the night back, especially him sitting alone beside our fire at 4 in the morning. What bothered me was how ordinary his arrival had seemed. He simply walked into our circle, talked with us, accepted firewood, and disappeared before morning. At the time, I treated him like a stranger. Years later, seeing that photograph made me wonder if I'd noticed something without understanding. I still can't say whether it was actually him. There was no proof either way. Still, remembering the spotless campsite and his sleepless night made the encounter feel much stranger.